They called Alexander Vance the Apache millionaire, a man rich enough to own a railroad and dangerous enough that even New York's most powerful men thought twice before crossing him. But on one stormy night in Manhattan, all his money could not buy him the one thing he desperately needed, a wife. Before midnight, then his poor maid was thrown bleeding at his feet. Alexander lifted her chin, looked into her frightened gray eyes, and gave the kind of command no servant had ever dared refuse. "I need a wife right now. Come with me." He thought she would be grateful. He thought she would obey. He was wrong. Elena knocked his hand away, and when she told him the one condition under which she would become his wife, for the first time in years, Alexander Vance did not know how to respond. The candle-lit crystal chandelier cast a golden glow across Alexander Vance's luxurious Manhattan study, but it could not soften the cold fury in his eyes. On the mahogany desk before him lay a single letter from the trustees controlling the Vance Railroad holdings. Its language was polite, precise, and merciless unless Alexander entered into a lawful marriage before midnight the following day. Controlling interest in the Arizona line would pass into the hands of the trust's secondary directors, men who had waited years for exactly such an opportunity. Alexander read the final paragraph once more and gave a low, humorless laugh. New York had spent years trying to decide what kind of man he was allowed to be. Its bankers welcomed his millions. Its railroad barons courted his investments, and its finest families drank his bourbon beneath his roof. Yet behind closed doors, they still called him the half-breed son of an Apache woman, a millionaire savage, a desert hawk dressed in an Eastern gentleman's black coat, civilized enough to make them rich, but never civilized enough to become one of them. And now they wanted to use marriage to chain the desert hawk by the throat. His fingers tightened around the crystal tumbler in his hand. A sharp crack split the silence. The glass shattered in his fist. Bourbon spilled between his fingers, followed by bright red blood that fell in slow drops onto the expensive Persian carpet. Alexander barely looked at the wound. Outside the tall windows, Manhattan disappeared beneath cold rain and gaslight. Tomorrow night, he could lose control of the railroad he had spent years fighting for. And somewhere in the shadows, Silas Vane would be waiting to pick over what remained. A muffled cry came from the hallway. Alexander raised his head. The study door burst open, and a young woman was shoved violently across the threshold. Elena Marlowe struck the marble floor on both knees. Her faded gray servant's dress was stained from work. Brown hair had escaped from beneath her white cap, and the collar of her dress had been torn enough to reveal fresh bruises across one shoulder. Behind her stood Harlan, the head steward, gripping a black walking cane. "Mr. Vance, forgive the interruption," Harlan said. "The girl broke the Severus vase in the East Hall. She has become careless and insolent. Her father's creditor is waiting at the servants' entrance. I intend to send her away with him and be done with the trouble." Elena said nothing. She did not cry. She did not beg. Slowly, despite the pain in her knees, she raised her head. Alexander knew her, though he had rarely spoken to her. Elena had served in his Manhattan house for nearly 2 years. He had seen her carrying breakfast trays before sunrise and polishing silver long after his wealthy guests had gone home. Like most servants, she had existed at the edges of his world, noticed only when something was wanted. Tonight, he noticed her eyes, gray as storm clouds, frightened, but strangely defiant. Alexander's gaze moved from those eyes to the bruises on her shoulder, then to Harlan's cane. "Get out." Harlan blinked. "Sir, I was only—" "Get out." Alexander did not raise his voice. He never needed to. Men who had faced him across courtroom tables knew that tone. Bankers knew it. Railroad presidents knew it. Even Silas Vane knew it. Harlan's face went pale. "Yes, sir." "And leave the cane." Harlan placed it against the wall and hurried from the room. The door closed, leaving only Elena's uneven breathing and the faint ticking of the clock. Alexander walked toward her. Broken crystal ground beneath his boots. He stopped in front of Elena and lowered himself onto one knee. Blood still ran across his palm as his rough fingers closed beneath her chin. Not gently. He lifted her face, forcing her to look directly into the hard, angular features of the man New York both despised and feared. Elena stiffened, but refused to lower her eyes. "You know who I am?" Alexander asked. "Yes, you know where I come from. I have worked in your house for 2 years. Mr. Vance, servants hear everything gentlemen believe they do not." Something flickered in his eyes. Alexander released her and rose. His gaze traveled briefly toward the letter on his desk, then returned to the bruised young woman before him. The solution came to him with almost brutal simplicity. He needed a lawful wife before tomorrow ended. Elena needed a door out of New York. "I need a wife right now," he said. "Come with me." Elena stared at him. It was not a proposal. It was a command. Alexander Vance had spent his adult life commanding men and watching them obey. Money opened doors. Power bent rules. Fear silenced enemies. He expected Elena to react like everyone else, with gratitude, obedience, perhaps disbelief that a penniless maid had just been offered the protection of a millionaire. Instead, she knocked his bloody hand away from her face. No. Alexander went completely still. Men with fortunes had hesitated before saying that word to him. Elena Marlowe said it, while kneeling in a torn servant's dress. "You misunderstand me," he said. "I understand you perfectly. I am offering you protection. You are offering me another master." His eyes darkened. Elena's legs trembled as she forced herself to stand. She was frightened. Alexander could see it in the quick rise and fall of her chest, but she stood anyway. "Your father's creditor is downstairs," Alexander said. "Would you rather leave with him?" "No." "Then what do you want?" Elena looked toward Harlan's abandoned cane. For years, other people had decided where she would sleep, when she would work, what she owed, and whom she must obey. Now the richest man she had ever known stood before her, expecting his fortune to make her surrender as easily as everyone else did. "I'll go with you," she said. Alexander's expression hardened with satisfaction. "But not for your money." The satisfaction vanished. Elena met his eyes. "Take me away from New York." "Where, west?" Alexander studied her. "Why?" She glanced once more at the cane. "I have heard the stories about Arizona, about your mother, about the life you had before New York taught you to wear expensive coats and frighten men from behind a desk." His jaw tightened at the mention of his mother. Elena continued before courage abandoned her. "I don't want jewels. I don't want servants. And I don't want to become a porcelain doll locked inside another rich man's house." "Then what do you want from me?" Her gray eyes returned to his. "Teach me how to survive without begging another man to save me." For the first time that night, Alexander Vance had no immediate answer. He had expected fear, gratitude, greed. He had not expected a poor maid with bruises beneath her collar to look at one of the richest men in New York and tell him his money was not enough. Slowly, something resembling a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Be ready in 10 minutes. I own almost nothing." "Good." Alexander reached for his black coat. Then we have nothing to wait for. Elena looked at the blood drying across his palm, then at her own trembling hands. Neither of them understood what had just been set in motion. He believed he had found a wife who could save his fortune. She believed she had found a road to freedom. Neither yet understood the price the other would demand from their heart. The blood covenant of two souls rejected by society had officially begun. But before this strange marriage could carry them west, someone was already watching, and what waited for them on the journey would turn their bargain into a fight for survival. If you want to see where Alexander and Elena's story leads, subscribe and stay with us. By 11 the next morning, Elena Marlowe no longer existed on paper. In a small judge's chamber far from the fashionable streets of Manhattan, with rain ticking against the windows and two witnesses who had been paid to keep their mouths shut, Elena stood beside Alexander in a plain dark dress and heard herself become Mrs. Alexander Vance. There were no flowers, no family, no music. Only the judge's tired voice, the scratching of a pen, and Alexander's blood-stained bandage showing beneath the cuff of his black coat. When the judge asked whether she took Alexander as her lawful husband, Elena hesitated for only a heartbeat. "I do." Alexander's answer came without hesitation. "I do." The words sounded strangely intimate, coming from a man who had spoken to her, as if negotiating the purchase of a railroad. When it was finished, Alexander placed a heavy envelope on the judge's desk. Elena expected him to leave immediately, but he turned to her instead. "Mrs. Vance." She looked up. Something about hearing the name made her uneasy. "I prefer Elena." For the faintest moment, amusement touched his mouth. "Then you should call me Alexander." "I don't think I'm ready for that. You married me 5 minutes ago." That required less courage. This time he actually smiled. It lasted perhaps a second, yet Elena remembered it. By noon they were standing inside one of Manhattan's finest dress shops. Alexander gave the proprietor a single instruction: whatever she needs. Within an hour, the gray servant's dress disappeared beneath layers of silk, velvet, lace, and deep satin. Elena stood before a 3-paneled mirror, while strangers fastened pearl buttons at her back and pinned her hair beneath a traveling hat that cost more than she had earned in 6 months. She hardly recognized herself. Alexander waited near the door. "Well?" Elena asked. His eyes traveled over her once. "You look expensive." Her eyebrows rose. "Is that supposed to be a compliment? In New York, it is. And in Arizona." Something unreadable passed through his face. In Arizona, expensive things don't always survive. Before she could ask what he meant, he turned away. Grand Central Depot was already boiling with rumors when they arrived. Someone had leaked the marriage. Reporters crowded the platform beneath clouds of steam. Flash powder burst white against Elena's eyes. Questions flew from every direction. "Mr. Vance, is it true you married your own maid?" "Mrs. Vance, how long have you known him? Was there money involved? Did you marry to satisfy the trust?" Elena froze. Alexander felt it immediately. His hand closed around her waist. Not roughly this time. Firmly. Protectively. "Smile," he murmured. "I'd rather bite one of them." Later. She almost laughed. Alexander guided her through the crowd, as if she had always belonged beside him. When a reporter pushed too close, Alexander needed only to look at the man for him to retreat. Then Elena noticed someone who was not shouting. A man stood beyond the reporters beneath the iron clock, wearing a brown overcoat and holding a folded newspaper. He was watching Alexander, not with curiosity, with patience. Elena looked away when a photographer called her name. When she glanced back, The man was gone. Their Pullman car seemed like another world. Polished walnut walls, brass lamps, velvet seats, and thick carpets swallowed the thunder of the wheels beneath them. By evening, New York had vanished behind miles of darkness. Elena sat beside the window, watching her reflection tremble over the glass. Alexander entered carrying a small medical case. "Your shoulder." She turned. "What about it?" "Let me see." The old command was still there. Elena's expression hardened. Alexander noticed. For a moment, neither moved. Then his voice changed. "May I?" It was such a small thing that another woman might not have noticed. Elena did. Slowly, she pulled the fabric away from her bruised shoulder. Alexander sat opposite her. His large hands could break crystal, intimidate railroad men, and sign papers worth millions. Yet when he touched the medicine to her bruises, his fingers were unexpectedly careful. Elena winced. "Sorry." She looked at him. Alexander Vance had just apologized. Perhaps he surprised himself as much as he surprised her. "You've done this before," she said. "Bandaged wounds, taken care of someone." His hand stopped. "My mother." The answer closed something behind his eyes. Elena did not push. Instead, she noticed blood seeping through the bandage around his palm. "Your turn." "It's nothing." That seems to be something men say when they're bleeding. Before he could object, Elena took his hand. For the first time, Alexander allowed someone else to tend his wound. Neither spoke. The train rolled westward beneath them. Her fingers were small against his scarred hand. His gaze lingered on her bent head, longer than necessary. Then Elena saw movement reflected in the window. A man passing through the corridor. Brown overcoat. She turned sharply. The corridor was empty. Alexander. It was the first time she had used his name. He heard the fear in it. "What?" "The man from the station." Alexander was already standing when the lamp in the corridor went out. Then another. Then another. Darkness traveled toward their compartment. Alexander reached beneath his coat. "Get down." The first bullet shattered the window. Glass exploded across the compartment. Elena dropped as Alexander pulled a revolver and fired through the doorway. A scream came from the corridor. Then the train erupted into chaos. Passengers shouted. Women screamed. Boots thundered overhead. Gunfire cracked through the Pullman cars, while black smoke poured past the windows. Alexander seized Elena and dragged her behind the heavy seat. "Stay here." "No." His eyes flashed toward her. "Now is not the time to argue with me." A bullet tore through the wood inches above his head. Elena grabbed the brass oil lamp from the wall. "What are you doing?" "Not waiting to be saved." She smashed it into the corridor. Oil spread across the floor. Flames surged upward, throwing a wall of fire and thick smoke between them and the advancing gunman. Alexander stared at her for half a second. Then the Desert Hawk smiled. "Remind me never to make you angry." Another gunshot ended the moment. Alexander fired twice through the smoke. A man collapsed. Suddenly, the entire carriage lurched violently. Elena was thrown against Alexander. His arm locked around her as luggage crashed from the racks. The train began to accelerate. Too quickly. Alexander's expression changed. "What is it?" Elena asked. He listened. No rhythm from the locomotive bell. No braking. Only the wheels screaming faster against steel. Alexander pulled open the carriage door and looked ahead through smoke and sparks. The engineer was no longer controlling the train. Far ahead, illuminated for a heartbeat by lightning, two rails ended in black emptiness. Someone had destroyed the track. Alexander turned toward Elena. For the first time since she had known him, she saw something in his face more frightening than anger. urgency. Hold on to something. Elena stared at him. Why? The locomotive screamed into the darkness. Alexander seized her hand. Because they didn't come here to rob us. His eyes returned to the broken track rushing toward them. They came to make sure we never reach Arizona. The locomotive reached the broken section of track with a scream of steel that seemed to tear the night open. Alexander had only seconds. He dragged Elena toward the rear platform, kicked open the emergency brake cabinet, and pulled the lever with both hands. The train shuddered so violently that windows burst along the Pullman car. Sparks sprayed beneath the wheels, somewhere ahead. Metal twisted with a shriek, like an animal being butchered. Elena, hold on. She barely had time to wrap both arms around the brass railing before the first carriage jumped the track. The world became noise, smoke, shattered glass, and darkness. Alexander threw himself over her as the rear cars slammed sideways. Elena felt his weight crush the breath from her lungs. A trunk flew above them and smashed against the wall. The Pullman tilted, groaned, then came to rest at a sickening angle. For several seconds, neither moved. Elena tasted blood. Alexander, I'm here. His voice came through clenched teeth. She pushed against him and felt something warm beneath her hand. Blood. A jagged piece of metal had torn through his coat near the ribs. You're hurt. I've been worse. You always say that. And so far I've always been right. Even now. She almost laughed. They climbed from the wreck before the surviving gunmen could regroup. Behind them, flames crawled along one of the derailed cars. The attack had failed to kill them, but it had done something almost as useful to their enemies. It had stranded them deep in the southwest, miles from the nearest reliable station. By sunrise, the last traces of civilization had vanished behind them. The land opened beneath a brutal sky. Red mesas rose in the distance like ruined fortresses. Dry grass whispered against stone. The sun climbed steadily until the air itself seemed to burn. Elena had never imagined silence could feel so enormous. She stopped after less than an hour and stared down at the remains of the blue satin dress Alexander had bought her in Manhattan. The hem was torn. One sleeve hung loose. Dust coated what had cost more than half a year of her wages. Alexander watched her. I warned you. Expensive things don't always survive. Arizona. Elena pulled a small knife from the supplies they had salvaged. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Without ceremony. She cut the dress just below the knees. Silk worth a small fortune fell into the dirt. Then she tore away the ruined lace at the sleeves. Alexander looked at the pieces scattered around her boots. That dress cost $80. Then New York has just donated $80 to the desert. He stared at her. Elena tied the remaining fabric firmly around her legs and looked up. Well, a slow smile appeared. Better. They found 2 horses at an abandoned way station before noon. Alexander chose the stronger one for Elena, despite her protests, and spent the next hour teaching her how to sit properly when the trail became uneven. Stop fighting the horse. I'm not fighting him. He disagrees. Elena gripped the reins harder. Alexander rode closer. Feel how he moves beneath you. I feel every bone in my body being rearranged. Relax your hips. She turned sharply. Mr. Vance. He nearly smiled. You married me, remember. That does not make every sentence respectable. For the first time since they had left New York, Alexander laughed openly. The sound surprised her. It was warmer than she expected. The desert began changing them, by degrees too small to notice. Alexander removed his tailored coat and roadied shirt sleeves. Dust settled into his dark hair. The polished millionaire Elena had watched from hallways disappeared beneath sun, sweat, and silence. She began to understand why the servants had spoken of him as two different men. In Manhattan, Alexander conquered rooms. Out here, he listened. He watched clouds, stones, grass, the flight of birds. He tested the wind against his face before choosing a direction. Near dusk, he dismounted beside a shallow wash. Water. Elena looked around. There was nothing but rock and thorn. You see any? No. Good. Start there. He showed her the darker vegetation gathered low between stones, the insects moving near damp ground, the way certain birds descended repeatedly toward one place. Never look for water, he told her. Look for everything that needs it. Elena crouched and touched the earth. And if I'm wrong, then you learn before the desert kills you. She looked up at him. That is a comforting teaching style. It kept me alive. Those words carried something heavier than the lesson itself. That night, they slept beneath a shelf of rock. Elena woke sometime before dawn to find Alexander sitting shirtless beside the dying fire, replacing the bandage around his ribs. Moonlight touched his back. She stopped breathing for a moment. Scars crossed him from shoulder to waist. Not one. Many. Some thin and pale, others thick. Crooked. Old. Alexander knew she was awake without turning. You can ask. Elena sat up. What happened? For a while he said nothing. My father sent me east when I was young. He thought money and schools could make men forget who my mother was. Did they? No. The word was almost amused. Alexander pulled the bandage tighter. At school, I was too Apache for white boys. Later, when I returned west, I was too white for men who only saw my father's name. Elena watched the fire. So you learn to become richer than all of them. I learned people insult a poor man to his face and a rich man behind his back. She smiled faintly. That sounds lonely. His hands stopped. Alexander looked at her then. Really looked. Loneliness is useful. It teaches you not to expect anything. Elena moved closer. Her fingers hovered over one long scar beside his shoulder blade. May I? He did not answer immediately. Then he nodded. She touched it. Alexander had endured knives, fists, bullets, courtroom insults, and years of contempt without flinching. But beneath the light touch of her fingers, his breath changed. Elena felt it. Neither spoke. The moment passed quietly. Yet afterward, nothing between them felt quite the same. The following afternoon, Alexander's wound began to worsen. He denied it until he nearly fell from his horse. Elena caught his arm. You're burning. Son, you are shivering. Desert nights. It is 3 in the afternoon. He tried to mount again and staggered. For once, Elena did not argue. She ordered, sit down. Alexander looked at her through fever-darkened eyes. Something almost proud flickered there. Yes, ma'am. She helped him beneath the shade of a rock shelf. Their water flask was nearly empty. Elena looked toward the horizon. Nothing. No river. No settlement. Alexander's voice came weakly behind her. Don't wander far. She remembered his lesson. Never look for water. Look for everything that needs it. Elena forced herself to breathe slowly. She watched the ground. A line of insects. Sparse green growth between 2 ridges. Then birds. Small brown birds descending beyond a cluster of rocks and rising again. Her heart quickened. She followed them. Behind the rocks she found only damp sand. For one terrible moment, she thought she had failed. Then she dug. Once, twice, again. Water seeped slowly into the hollow. Elena laughed aloud. By sunset she returned carrying enough to wet Alexander's lips, clean his wound, and keep them alive another day. He opened his eyes as she knelt beside him. Where? You taught me. Alexander drank, then looked at her for a long time. You don't need me anymore. Elena went still. That was never what I asked for. Something passed between them that neither was brave enough to name. 3 days later, Alexander was strong enough to ride. By late afternoon, they climbed the final ridge. Elena reached the top first and stopped. Below them stretched a vast valley washed in gold. Adobe homes rested beside cottonwoods. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Horses moved through fenced pasture land. Beyond them, red cliffs glowed beneath the setting sun. For the first time since leaving New York, Elena understood that Alexander had not been riding toward wealth. He had been riding home. Then hoofbeats thundered up the opposite trail. A lone rider appeared, horse white with foam. He recognized Alexander and pulled hard on the reins. Mr. Vance. Alexander's face changed. The rider struggled for breath. You have to get down there. Now. Why? The man looked once at Elena, then back at Alexander. Men from New York are coming. The rider's warning followed them down into the valley, like the shadow of a storm. But no men from New York appeared that night. Instead, Elena discovered the world Alexander Vance had never spoken about. Children ran toward him before his horse had fully stopped. An old man embraced him without bowing. Women called his name from adobe doorways, and men covered in dust from the corrals came to shake his hand. Some spoke English, others Spanish, and Elena heard Apache words she did not understand, moving warmly between them. Nobody called him Mr. Vance until business demanded it. Nobody seemed frightened of him. That unsettled Elena more than fear would have. In Manhattan, people stepped aside when Alexander entered a room. Here, they stepped toward him. A broad-shouldered woman with silver threaded through her black hair came out of the largest adobe house and struck Alexander lightly across the chest. You took too long. Alexander, who could silence a room of bankers with one look, accepted the blow without protest. Good to see you too, Rosa. Then Rosa Delgado noticed Elena. Her eyes moved from Elena's ruined satin dress to the wedding ring on her finger. Oh, she said. Alexander cleared his throat. Rosa, this is Elena, my chief. Rosa stared at him, then at Elena, then back at him. You're what? For the first time Elena had ever seen, Alexander Vance looked almost uncomfortable. My wife. Rosa crossed herself. I leave you alone with rich people for 6 months, and you come home married. Elena laughed before she could stop herself. Alexander gave her a dark look, but there was no anger behind it. That first night, Elena learned why Alexander had fought so fiercely for the Arizona holdings. She saw families living along the river on land protected by his deeds. She saw a small school built with his money and a well whose stonework carried no Vance name. She learned that when drought killed cattle 2 summers earlier, Alexander had forgiven debts rather than take ranches from families who could not pay him. The railroad supplied work, but it also carried medicine, grain, tools, and mail into settlements that investors in New York knew only as numbers on maps. No statue bore Alexander's face. No brass plaque praised his generosity. He had never told her any of it. That mattered more. Elena had thought he was fighting to keep what belonged to him. Now she began to understand that Alexander's greatest flaw and greatest virtue came from the same place. He needed to control everything because he could not bear to watch helplessly while something under his protection was destroyed. Over the following days, Elena stopped feeling like a guest. At first she helped because she did not know what else to do. She cleaned Ama's infected cut with supplies from Alexander's house. The next morning, 3 mothers appeared with children, needing attention. When Rosa discovered Elena could read and write well, she pushed a stack of battered books into her arms and pointed toward the schoolhouse. There are 12 children in there who believe arithmetic is a punishment from God. I'm not a teacher. Neither am I. That has never stopped me. Within a week, Elena was teaching letters beneath a roof that leaked sunlight through its boards. Alexander sometimes watched from outside. She pretended not to notice. He pretended he had come to inspect the horses he sees. One afternoon, Elena caught him leaning against the fence, while a little Apache girl sat beside her, laboriously writing her name. "You've been inspecting that same horse for 20 minutes. Elena called. Alexander glanced at the animal. Complicated horse. The children laughed. So did Elena. Something inside Alexander softened each time he heard that sound. The changes in him were small. He began asking instead of commanding. "Would you ride with me? Do you want supper? May I see your shoulder?" The man who had once seized her chin without permission now sometimes stopped his hand an inch from hers and waited. Elena noticed every time. One evening, they stood together beside the corral as the desert sunset burned crimson behind the mountains. Elena wore a simple cotton dress Rosa had given her. The expensive New York silk was gone. Her hands were sun-browned now. A faint scar marked one palm, and dust covered her boots. Alexander looked at her for so long that she became self-conscious. "What?" "Nothing." That was not a nothing look. "You've changed." Elena looked toward the valley. "So have you." His eyes remained on her. "Have I, in New York? You ordered me to marry you. You said yes. I said no first, I remember. I think that was the first time anyone had ever told you no. The first time anyone survived it." She smiled. Alexander stepped closer. The teasing disappeared. The evening wind moved a strand of hair across Elena's cheek. Alexander lifted his hand, then stopped. He waited. Elena did not move away. His fingers brushed the strand from her face. Neither of them breathed properly after that. "You once said loneliness was useful." Elena whispered. "I was wrong." The words were so quiet she almost missed them. Her heart struck hard against her ribs. Alexander lowered his head. Elena closed her eyes. "Mrs. Vance." A child's voice chattered the moment. They sprang apart. A boy came running from the schoolhouse, carrying Elena's forgotten book. Rosa, watching from a doorway, rolled her eyes toward heaven. Later that night, Elena lay awake, smiling into the darkness, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine something dangerous, staying, not because of their contract, not because she needed protection, because she wanted mornings in that valley. Children shouting outside the schoolhouse, Rosa complaining about her cooking, Alexander coming home covered in dust, perhaps even his hand reaching for hers in the dark. The thought frightened her more than New York ever had. The next morning, Elena entered Alexander's study, looking for writing paper. A drawer stood partly open. Inside was an envelope. Her name was written across it. Elena Vance. She hesitated, then opened it. The first page was legal language. The second made her hands begin to shake. Alexander had instructed his attorneys to prepare papers dissolving their marriage once the trust's requirements had been permanently satisfied. There was money set aside for her, a house, if she wanted it, enough income that she would never need to serve another person again. Freedom. Everything she had once asked for. And suddenly, it felt like rejection. Elena read the final line twice. Alexander had signed it 3 days earlier. 3 days ago. After the desert. After she had touched his scars. After he had told her she no longer needed him. A terrible understanding settled inside her. Perhaps she had mistaken gratitude for tenderness. Perhaps the valley had become home only to her. Perhaps Alexander had never intended her to stay. Elena. Rosa stood in the doorway. Elena quickly folded the papers, but not before Rosa saw her face. "He's letting me go," Elena whispered. Rosa looked at the envelope, then at her. "Did he say that?" "He signed it." "That is not what I asked." Elena swallowed hard. Rosa came closer. "Did that man ask you to stay?" Elena could not answer. Before Rosa could say more, a rifle shot cracked outside. Not aimed at anyone. A warning. Then came the thunder of horses' hisses. Elena and Rosa rushed onto the porch. Dust rolled across the entrance to the valley as a column of riders approached. At their head rode a man in an immaculate black coat, absurdly clean against Arizona earth. Alexander was already walking toward them. Elena had never seen his face become so cold. Silas. Silas Vane dismounted slowly. Behind him stood armed deputies, several hired men, and one older man whose face made Elena's blood turn to ice. Her father. Walter Marlowe would not meet her eyes. Silas removed his gloves with leisurely precision. "Alexander, you do make a man travel a remarkable distance to finish unfinished business." Alexander positioned himself between them and Elena. Silas smiled. Then his gaze moved past Alexander and settled on her. "Mrs. Vance." Elena clutched the freedom papers against her chest. Silas noticed them. His smile widened. "Well, I see you've already discovered one secret." Alexander turned sharply toward Elena. Silas stepped closer. "But I'm afraid that isn't the important one." The valley went silent. Silas Vane looked directly into Elena's eyes. "Mrs. Vance, your husband hasn't told you everything." Silas Vane's words settled over the valley, more heavily than any gunshot. "Mrs. Vance, your husband hasn't told you everything." Alexander stood between Elena and the riders, his shoulders motionless, his face carved from stone. "Say what you came to say." "Silas, with pleasure." Silas removed a folded document from inside his coat. "Your marriage satisfied the trust temporarily, but the trustees were never given the full circumstances. Mr. Vance married a household servant less than 24 hours before the deadline, a woman accused of theft, fleeing a lawful debt claim." Elena felt the old fear return. Then Silas looked toward Walter Marlowe. Her father finally raised his eyes. "I told them the truth." "Elena," he said weakly, "you took jewelry from the Vance house before you ran." Elena stared at him. "You know I didn't." Walter's mouth trembled. "You left me debts. Your debts." Silas raised a hand as if calming children. "The distinction is irrelevant. We have a sworn statement, a complaint, filed in New York, and grounds to challenge the marriage as an arrangement designed to defraud the trust. Until the matter is decided, control of the Arizona holdings passes to the secondary directors." His smile returned. "To Maid capable of managing them responsibly." Alexander's voice was quiet. "You mean you. I mean civilization." Silas glanced across the adobe homes, corrals and families gathering in frightened silence. "These lands have been wasted long enough." Something savage flashed through Alexander's eyes. His hand moved toward his coat. Elena caught his wrist. For a moment, the entire valley seemed to hold its breath. Alexander looked down at her hand. Months ago, or what felt like months, he would have brushed it aside. This time he stopped. Elena shook her head. "No." The word that had once challenged him in a Manhattan study now saved him from becoming exactly what Silas expected. Alexander slowly removed his hand from his coat. Then he smiled. Silas's confidence faltered. You always did make one mistake, Alexander said. You thought because my mother was Apache, I would eventually solve your problems with a gun. He walked toward the porch and picked up a leather case. But my father taught me something useful too. He opened it. Paper can kill a man just as thoroughly. Silas's smile disappeared. Alexander removed several documents. The Arizona line is not yours to see, Weiss. The trust controls railroad shares. It does not control the valley. Silas frowned. Alexander continued. 3 years ago, I separated the water rights, grazing deeds and residential parcels from the railroad corporation. Last winter, they were transferred into an independent land trust. He handed the papers to the senior deputy. For the benefit of the families already living here. The deputy began reading. Silas stepped forward. You cannot. I already did. Alexander produced another sheet. And the theft charge against Elena. Now he looked at Walter. That was your second mistake. Walter went pale. Alexander's voice hardened. The Sivres vase Harlan accused her of breaking was found intact in storage after we left New York. The jewelry listed in your complaint had been sold 6 weeks earlier. Silas's eyes narrowed. Alexander held up the final document. To you. Silence. Walter looked at Silas in horror. You said nobody would know. Elena closed her eyes. There it was. The truth. Not dragged from her father by courage, but by fear. Silas turned on him. Shut your mouth. Too late. The deputy folded the documents. Mr. Vane, until these papers are examined, I have no authority to seize this property or arrest Mrs. Vance. You were paid to enforce the law. I was paid to come here and enforce a warrant, not manufacture one. Silas stared around the valley. Nobody moved for him. Nobody lowered their eyes. For the first time, Elena saw what Alexander must have seen in Manhattan countless times. A powerful man, discovering that power disappears the moment people stop believing in it. But Walter was still staring at her. Elena. She turned. He stepped toward her. You cannot stay here. You're my daughter. For years those words would have been enough. Daughter. Duty. Debt and obedience. Elena looked at the man who had taught her that love meant owing someone forever. Then she looked at Alexander. He said nothing. He did not step forward. He did not rescue her. He simply waited. And Elena understood. This was the lesson she had asked him to teach. She walked toward her father herself. Walter pulled a folded debt note from his coat. You owe me for everything I gave you. Elena took the paper. For a moment, she remembered her mother's funeral. Cold rooms, empty cupboards. Years spent scrubbing other people's floors while Walter gambled away tomorrow. Then she tore the note in half. Again and again. The pieces fell into the Arizona dust. I was your daughter, she said. I was never your property. Walter stared at the scraps at his feet. Elena turned her back on him. Silas Vane left the valley without the railroad, without the land, and without Elena. His riders followed. Walter went with them, smaller somehow than when he had arrived. No shot was fired. None was needed. By sunset, the dust of their departure had vanished. But Elena's victory felt strangely hollow. She stood alone beside the corral, with Alexander's freedom papers in her hands. He approached quietly. You found them. Yes. Alexander stopped several feet away. Elena hated the distance. When were you going to tell me? When everything was safe. For whom? For you. Her eyes burned. You signed them after the desert. Yes. After I found water for you. Yes. After I touched your scars. His voice softened. Yes. Elena looked away. Do you want me to leave? No. The answer came so quickly that she turned back. Alexander's composure had finally cracked. No, he repeated. God, no. Then why give me these? He looked at the papers. When I met you, I thought I could solve your life the way I solved everything else. With money, a contract, an order. His gaze lifted to hers. I put my hand on you without asking. I told you to come with me as though wanting something gave me the right to have it. Elena said nothing. You asked me to teach you how not to need saving. He stepped closer. You learned. Another step. And somewhere along the way, you taught me something I should have learned years ago. What? Alexander looked at the woman who had crossed half a country beside him. That staying only means something if you are free to leave. Elena's breath caught. So the papers are yours, and the money. Yours, the house. Yours, what if I take all of it and leave tomorrow? Pain crossed his face. But he answered, Then I'll have my horse saddled for you before sunrise. That was when Elena finally understood. Alexander Vance had once offered her everything because he believed everything could be bought. Now, he was willing to lose the one thing he wanted most because he had learned she could not. Elena looked down. Alexander. Yes, you once told me loneliness was useful. I've reconsidered. She laughed through the tears in her eyes. The desert wind moved softly between them. Alexander held out his hand. Elena. Yes, come with me. Not an order. Not this time. Elena looked at his hand. The same hand that had once forced her chin upward on a cold floor in Manhattan. The hand that had held a revolver on the train, taught her to read the desert, trembled beneath her fingers when she touched his scars, and finally learned how to open instead of close. He did not seize her. He did not pull. Alexander Vance simply waited. Elena placed her hand in his. Where? Alexander looked toward the lights beginning to glow across the valley. Home. Elena followed his gaze. She saw the little schoolhouse, Rosa standing in a doorway, pretending not to watch. Children chasing each other beneath the cottonwoods. Smoke curling into the violet evening. Beyond them, the red cliffs burned with the last light of the setting sun. Then she looked at Alexander, the millionaire who had needed a wife, the lonely man who had learned how to ask one to stay. Elena tightened her fingers around his. I am home. When I finished writing the final lines of this story, I found myself sitting quietly for a long time, still thinking about Alexander and Elena. I realized that what made me care so deeply for them was not that Alexander was a powerful millionaire, nor that Elena rose from a poor maid to a better life. What stayed with me was that they were both lonely in their own way. One man possessed almost everything, yet did not know how to hold a heart. One woman had almost nothing, yet refused to surrender the right to choose her own life to anyone. And perhaps that is what I most hope to leave with you through this story. The person who truly loves us is not the one who builds a more beautiful cage to keep us inside. It is the one who opens the door, places freedom in our hands, and has the courage to stand there and let us choose for ourselves. Because in the end, the most beautiful thing is not having someone who cannot leave you. It is having someone who is completely free to walk away, yet still looks into your eyes and says, I am home. And if one day you no longer remember every detail of what happened to Alexander and Elena, I hope you will still remember that moment, a man who finally learned to open his hand, and a woman who was finally free to choose the hand she wanted to hold.